You should all be seeing the first slide of the methods for economic analysis. And
Good.
as Michelle said, I'm going to be kind of going over how we did this, how we put things together for the 8 case studies that we've completed so far. I'm going to be talking about an overview of the partial budget analysis that we've been discussing, the format that we use to do the evaluation. I'll go over the questionnaire vehicle that we use to collect the data. After a 5-minute break, then I'll be getting into the calculator itself that we use to actually crunch the numbers and come up with that partial budget analysis. And then I'm going to wrap up with a few tips on how to make adjustments to fit different production systems that you might be wanting to try out with the calculator. So the partial budget analysis, many of you may be familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, I'm just going to spend a few minutes here, but it basically estimates the economic effect of changes, in this case in a farming operation, and we're limiting that effect just to what's changed or what is affected by that change in operation, in this case going to soil health. So we're not looking at, for example, a bunch of crop budgets where we have all the different activities that go to establishing, maintaining, and harvesting a crop. We're really only looking at those activities that are changing when they go to from what they were doing before, whether it's conventional tillage, to moving forward with no-till or strip-till. And we're basically comparing those costs from before and the costs after. What benefits did they see, or did they lose income as a result of making this change? So in the case of our specific study, we had 7 primary benefits here. We looked at changes in machinery costs, changes in fertilizer cost or pesticide use, any yield changes that may have occurred, any erosion repair or even changes to erosion rate on the farm, the learning costs that the farmer reported, and then anything that we may have missed that falls outside of these broad categories we just have as other. And you'll see that we've covered that in the questionnaire and in the calculator. The result of all of this is a table which Michelle showed you earlier, a partial budget analysis results table. This is for our sample farm, Dan Lane's farm there in Ohio. And as Michelle said, the left side of the table houses all the positive effects and the right side shows the negative effects. This table is further divided where we have any effects of income in the upper half of the table. So if income increased, we show that over here. Decreases in income are on the right side. The lower half, we have any decreases in costs, which are a benefit. And on the right side, any increases in costs, or a cost, or I don't know, the opposite of benefit, cost, basically. So then we sum up each of the 4 quadrants of the table. So over on this side, we have total decreases in costs. And on this side, we have the total increase in costs. And then down below, we total up both parts of this side of the table, get 174,000. We had an income change of 130,000 plus their decrease in costs. On this side, there were no negative effects on income, so we're just looking at the costs or the increased costs of adopting the soil health practices on Dan Lane's operation to get the total decrease in net income of about 72,000. So there's 4 things about a partial budget analysis that you need to keep in mind. One of them is that we have this up here in the corner, 2018. That's the year that all of the values in this table are based on. You want to make sure that your values all come from the same cost year, whatever year that is. We were doing these interviews in 2019, and so the most recent available cost data was the prior year, 2018. It's very hard to put together analysis using current cost data because it's constantly evolving in real time. And so we go with the prior year's annual average values. And so that's what you see in this table. That's why this says 2018 right here. The other part that is important is that your unit of analysis is consistent. You have to have, in this case, we use per acre costs when we do the interviews. We're asking for per acre information from the farmer. But we also take into account the number of acres that this value is applied to. And so we have, in this case, we had 1,830 acres of farmland to come up with their total. So we're being consistent in the price base. We're being consistent in the per acre land area that's being evaluated. And the third part of this is that all the costs are on an annual basis. So in the case of machinery, Dan may have had to buy a new piece of equipment. We're not going to show over here, I guess it would come over here as a cost. We wouldn't show the total cost of that new piece of equipment in this table because that's a capital investment that should be spread over many years. So all of the costs that are in this partial budget analysis are annual or per year costs. It's the amount of money either coming into their wallet or going out from their wallet each year, from making a comparison from before they adopted the soil health to after. So that's basically how this table is set up. As Michelle mentioned, we have the totals down here at the bottom. This is for the full study area on the farm. We have a per acre value here, and we have their 142% return on investment. I'm going to just go to the next tab here, and we'll talk a little bit about return on investment. Basically, it's measuring what you receive back compared with what you put into something. ROI equals the net benefits divided by the total cost. If we go back to this workbook table that we have right here, here is that net benefit of 102,000. And basically what we did was we took this number and divided it by the 72,000 cost that we came up with. And that's where that 142% came from. So now I'm going to turn to talking about what we did to get to the partial budget analysis, what the various parts of it. And I try to simplify things, so I really only have 3 steps here, but each step is pretty complicated and there's quite a bit going on behind the scenes here. But we start out with a data collection where we're conducting a farmer interview using that questionnaire, and then we move into entering that information into the calculator. And this step is pretty time consuming because typically the values that come into the questionnaire may not make total sense for going into the calculator. It may involve going back, listening to the interview recording some to kind of figure out exactly what the farmer meant by something, and making sure that everything is kind of flowing and makes sense to go into the calculator. Then once everything's entered, the final step is just to make sure that those results make sense. And this step involves not only the author looking at it, but then Michelle and I would take a look at each of the calculator's results, go through them with the author, and the 3 of us talking about it. Is this really how this plays out? Does this make sense going from the questionnaire to the calculator? Is this really how it worked out? Once we're satisfied that we have that information, we take it a step further and ask the farmer to review it. Do these results look like what you expected to see? And then finally, as part of that review where Michelle showed you the slide of all the reviewers, all of them are helping us with this red face test too. It's not just the author, it's not just our little team, it's not the farmer, it's a whole group of people are taking a look at this just to make sure that it makes sense, because we want the information that we put out there to be well received and to feel confident that we're doing the best job we can do to accurately portray what happened on that farm. So the questionnaire itself, the first part of this process for getting to a public or partial budget analysis, has 2 parts. First, we're going to be collecting information on the soil health story itself, asking some open-ended questions, trying to get the farmer talking about what they did before, what they're doing now. And this is sort of not quantifiable, but qualitative information. And it's the tidbits that make the case study interesting, to just have some remarks, some quotes from the farmer even, to weave into the case study as we're writing it, because we don't want it to just be a bunch of numbers. It also includes this three-page questionnaire that the farmer either completes on their own ahead of time or over the phone with the AFT author who's working with that farmer. And this questionnaire has two purposes. One of them is to get a handle on their farm operation and kind of figure out whether we can use the whole operation as our study area, or whether it makes sense to hone in on a portion of the farm for the study area. If they have a bunch of different rotations and they're doing different things for soil health on different rotations, we want to pick the rotation that makes the most sense or gives us the best story for the case study. The other part of it is getting some information on the focus field that Michelle, for the environmental analysis that Michelle will be talking about later. So within that larger study area, we want them to pick out a field that would be a good representation for running the environmental modeling to look at those off-site or environmental effects. The second part of the questionnaire is getting into the economic effects of those soil health practices. In the case that what we've set up, we have up to 4 soil health practices being used for the analysis. And then we also have a section that we're looking at the changes in the soil. And this is kind of getting back to qualitative information. Again, it's not really used in the economic analysis, but to the extent that we haven't gotten that information at the beginning of the questionnaire, we just kind of focus in on the soil and try to ask some questions about what the farmer sees happening in the soil. And then also whether they've seen any changes to the soil in terms of drought resistance, or what happens if they get a lot of water, a lot of rainfall. Has there been any improvements in that regard? So now I'm being prompted to show you Dan Lane's questionnaire. You should see it up here on the screen. So this was the actual questionnaire for Dan Lane. I will say it didn't look like this when Brian Brandt conducted the interview. It would have been scribbled over in his handwriting. I'm sure he was sitting there writing away furiously as the farmer was talking. But Brian was nice enough to then come, after he got back and had some time, to type in and fill in this new questionnaire with the farmer's responses. So it's much easier to read and it looks much cleaner, but this is kind of a messy process, and so you should be prepared for that. I don't want to mislead you that you're just going to come back with something nice and tidy like this. But anyway, like I said, I've kind of changed the information here to protect Dan's a little bit of his personal information, but we do get this information from the farmer so that obviously we can go back and get back in touch if we need to. Here's those general questions I talked about. How long have you been farming? Who you farm with? Why did you adopt these soil health practices on your farm? This farmer said he was interested in return on investment and protecting the soil and eliminating runoff while building his soils. So there's some information that can go into the case study, what his motivation was. We asked him what they like about the practices they've adopted. And then this is the question about problems, and Michelle talked about this a little bit too. I mean, this is really important. And what I've found is that if you write a case study and the farmer doesn't really say they had any problems, everything worked perfectly, I didn't really have to change anything, I just magically switched from conventional tillage to no-till and went off flawlessly, I think people would have a hard time believing that. And so we really try to get some information from the farmers about what went wrong, what did you do to change it, how did you deal with that problem. This makes the document much more relatable to other people, because they don't want to think that that this farmer is a tech whiz and maybe has all this knowledge that they don't possess, and so why should they even try? It's always good to kind of see where people had problems and what they did to solve them, and gives that farmer ideas of what they might do if they encounter difficulty while adopting soil health practices. We ask about leasing land, on the farm. And this has to do with perhaps they had challenges in adopting soil health practices on the land that they were leasing. And so we want to hear about that. And then we also have a question on the education time. How much time did you spend, or how much time do you typically spend in a year learning about soil health practices on your farm? Because this is definitely a cost. Many farmers don't tend to perhaps think about their time the way economists might, but it's always good to try to take that into account because it's a real cost for adopting soil health. You have to spend some time learning about it first. Then we have a couple questions about technical assistance, whether they received it, who they received it from, whether they've attended any workshops. And I believe that these questions may have been added after Brian completed his interview, because these documents are, I guess you could say they're living documents. We're constantly tweaking them and changing them, trying to make them better. And so I believe that's why we don't have any information filled in here on this particular form, because he had already conducted the interview when we made that change. And then you can see Brian added a few notes from the farmer, some other stuff that he mentioned during the interview. Now we're getting into the part, this is the information that was collected ahead of time, that separate form, which we take and then plunk into the questionnaire so everything is in one document. It just makes it easier for going back and looking things up. And by the way, this questionnaire not only serves as a data collection vehicle, this is our documentation. This documents the source for the information that's being used in the partial budget analysis. And so it's basically part of the record that goes behind the analysis. It's important to know that we just didn't make up these numbers and plunk them into the workbook. This is where they came from. This is from the farmer. We have a recording of the farmer providing this information. And so we try to do as much as we can to document where we got everything and how it was used in the tool. So we start out with a little bit of general information about the farm and how many rotations do they have. And as you can see, our sample farmer, Dan Lane, only has one rotation. So that makes things kind of easy for us. And we get into asking questions about irrigation, whether he has livestock on the farm. Then question 6, we're getting into more specifics. For each of the rotations on the farm, we want to know what soil health practices they adopted, for which crops, how many acres of for each soil health practice, and in what was the first year when they started using that practice, what's their current acreage, and the current year. And so each of these tables would be filled out. You know, we've got potentially 3 rotations here. We would take this information and then figure out, okay, which of these rotations are they doing the most for soil health? Which one has the most acreage involved, the most practices involved? That's probably what we want to use for our study area, for identifying that study area. Then we have another kind of general informational question asking the farmer to recite what economic benefits they've actually seen from adopting those soil health practices on their farm. So he's saying better organic matter, recovering organic matter, better moisture retention. He likes injected banding for nutrient management, more efficient nutrient utilization, he says. So those are some additional information that can go into the case study. And here's the part on the focus field. This is being used for the environmental analysis, and it talks about, you know, wanting to make sure that if there were structural practices installed on that field, that they were installed before they began using the soil health practice on the field. We don't want to muddy up the results by having some structural change that went in, you know, maybe they put a brass waterway in or something partway through the period of the analysis. We really can't have that going on, so whatever focus field they pick needs to be pretty stable in terms of those structural practices. We just want to see what happened because of the soil health practices being adopted. And so then there's some more information. Where is that field located? What are its coordinates? And then we ask that they identify the soil health practices being used on that field and some soil organic matter data. And then finally, we have a question about the photos, and Michelle already talked about that, but this is where they would talk about photos they might have available themselves. Now we're at part two. So this is the part where our interviewer would actually be sitting down with the farmer. Well, actually, those first questions at the beginning, those general questions, were part of that interview as well. But this is the part where we get into the economic effects, and it's split up into the 4 practices. The first one here is no-till or other forms of reduced tillage. And we're getting at the changes in the equipment or the machinery that's being used here. And so we have the before situation, what machinery were they using before they adopted strip till, what are they using now? And you can see they've indicated their equipment, the size of the equipment, the number of passes per year. And just looking at these 2 tables, you can see that they went from 7 passes down to 4. And so we can expect that they're probably saving some money here because of going to reduced tillage, which shouldn't be too surprising. We also have soybeans down here, same thing, their other crop. What were you doing before? What are you doing now? Number of passes. Second question in the tillage part has to do with yield change. Did you see any changes in yield? And Michelle mentioned this 40 bushel per acre increase in corn yields when she was showing Dan Lane's partial budget analysis there. But we see that this yield change is attributable to 2 practices. And so because of that, it's not going to be attributed just to tillage. It's going to be put onto what we call a combined practice effects tab, which we'll be seeing in a little while in the workbook itself. So even though this questionnaire is set up to attribute impacts or effects to each of the individual practices, there is an option to evaluate them as combined practice effects. And so that's what we did with the yield change for the corn on this particular case study. Likewise, our next question here on changes in fertilizer use was also combined practices according to the farmer. He didn't want to attribute it to just tillage or to just nutrient management. He felt it was basically due to the combination of all the practices that he was using on the farm. And it's kind of unusual. This farmer actually increased his fertilizer use as he went into using these soil health practices. He may have been underutilizing fertilizer in the past.
Well,
now,
just Jody gave me a 5-minute till break red flag, so just
right?
FYI.
Oh boy. Thank you. I'm going to have to speed up here.
No
as
problem.
much fun as this is.
Sure.
So I skipped through, but we do have changes to agrochemical inputs here. If there was any associated with tillage, you would put them in there. We have the changes to erosion here. And he's just got some qualitative information. He said that even though he does have washouts, his equipment, when he goes through, basically would take care of that repair back before he changed to no-till. He doesn't have that anymore. It took care of it, but he didn't really have a cost before because it just all those 7 passes over the field, I guess, took care of all those washouts. This question on financial assistance, I'm just going to take a few minutes here, even though I only have 5 left and I've got to speed up. But we do ask about financial assistance in all of our interviews. This is not part of the partial budget analysis. We keep it aside because it really isn't an effect of the practice itself. This is something kind of outside of it. It's kind of like what we consider a windfall profit that the farmer got because they say tried cover cropping or something of that sort. I also want to say that the farmers that we interviewed, only about half of them received financial assistance. 3 of them, they were basically tweaking practices that they already had through the Conservation Security Program. 1 of the 4 farmers did receive Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP money, to adopt new practices, cover cropping and no-till, but it was only on a portion of the farm. And so we have some complexities here. Not only is it not the result of the practice, it's not a practice effect. Quite often it's not on the entire study area or the entire farm. And also these types of payments are not available to all farmers and they're temporary. And so for all of those reasons, we left them out of the analysis, but we do acknowledge their existence, and to the extent that a farmer did receive financial assistance, we try to report on that in the case study. Then finally, down at the bottom, we have whatever other types of effects might have happened as a result of a practice, but were not covered in the preceding portions of that portion of the questionnaire. The next practice we have is cover crops. And as you can see, we just ask for all the information having to do cover crop establishment in the first section here. The rest of this looks familiar. It's basically the same effects that we had for the tillage tab. And in the interest of time, I won't belabor it, except to say at the very bottom, we do have grazing and haying for cover crops, which is a unique to this practice. So there's an opportunity to enter information here to the extent that the farmer is grazing their cover, or if they're harvesting their cover as hay. Nutrient management, we have a few questions here at the beginning having to do with the nutrient management plan. This information is really more for the case study itself. It doesn't factor into the economic analysis. We ask about what they were doing before for nutrient management. What are they doing now? Again, more descriptions that can go into the case study. Then we get into what's very similar to the tillage tab, where we have before and after implement usage having to do with nutrient management. And here we have a tool, one pass before, two passes now, but they're actually putting it on during strip till when they're tilling the ground in the spring for planting. So guess what? We really don't have a change in the number of passes for nutrient management. That was unchanged, but we do show it in the questionnaire, some of the intricacies of what the farmer did as a result of adopting nutrient management. The rest of this is the same as the other tillage tab that we were just looking at. And then the final practice is conservation crop rotation. And here we're just asking the same questions again about yield changes, about changes to nutrients, about changes to pesticides, erosion, financial assistance, and then any other benefits or costs. And then the last part of the questionnaire has to do with changes in the soil. And this again is not used in economic analysis, but is good information to the extent that we get it to put into the case study. And for whatever reason, this particular questionnaire is a little bit light on this part of it. I'm not sure what happens. Sometimes by the end of the interview, the farmers run out of time or something, and they may not get to this part. So hopefully you get lots of good information at the start. And I believe a lot of this soil related information was actually covered in some of those first questions that came at the beginning.